there's a lot of people that argue that we are actually seeing very high inflation at the moment. It's just that the official data, CPI, Consumer Price Index data, isn't showing it. And this is a common criticism you find, by people. Almost always they say, real inflation is actually much higher because when you go to the high street, everything's so expensive and houses are so expensive, so inflation must be much higher. The question is that true or not? And so this piece I published tries to address that, how accurate are official CPI data? So I focus on the US just because the US is the biggest economy, but this applies also to other developed economies. Let me just share my screen. So if I just show you some of the kind of the charts I was focusing on. So one of the main kind of theses of people who think inflation should be much higher is that money supply has really picked up a lot since COVID. So this gray line here shows you US M2, money supply growth. So the different measures of money supply, there's M0, which is just cash, M1, which includes sort of deposits, time deposits, M2 has some kind of lending, I think, in there, then M3 is broader, has more loans and so on. But essentially, since last year, since COVID, this M2 money supply has exploded higher. So kind of cash and deposits have really exploded higher. And so many people are saying that because this is so high, surely inflation should be much higher as well. In reality, the correlation between money supply and inflation is actually relatively low. So you have these periods, for example, in the mid-1990s, money supply growth started to pick up, but inflation did kind of nothing. Around the financial crisis, you did kind of see some similar moves, but since the financial crisis, money supply growth has been running at much higher levels than inflation. And even in the 70s, when inflation was picking up, you see in the early 70s, when you had the breakdown of Bretton Woods, money supply shot up, inflation stayed low. It's almost like an inverse relationship. And there's all sorts of different reasons for this. One reason is that money supply is quite a nebulous concept. So why should we focus just on bank deposits? Why not look at bank lending? Why not look at non-bank lending? Why don't you look at offshore dollar lending as well? There's lots of different types of money and credit that's out there. And the line between money and credit gets blurred a bit as well. And so if you look at more of an aggregate measure, you end up with a somewhat different sort of picture. But the main point here is the relationship between money supply and inflation is very weak. And that's one of the reasons why central banks have stopped focusing on money supply so much, because it doesn't really give you much kind of indication. And the other more basic point I would make is that if money supply has grown so much and you believe that's inflationary, then why hasn't inflation picked up over the last 12 months? Because you've had an environment where if money supply has grown 25% in the last 12 months, surely inflation should pick up over the last 12 months as well. Surely it should be coincidental, and that hasn't happened. So first, I think it's a bit of a misnomer to focus on money supply, but nevertheless, this is one of the reasons people do look at this. Another problem with looking at money supply is that if money or credit expands in an economy, you don't have to just use it to buy stuff. You can also use it to buy a house. You can use it to buy Bitcoin. You can use it to buy stocks. So it's unclear, why all that extra money that's been created should necessarily go into the real economy. It could just as easily go into financial markets, which is often the case. So that's kind of one kind of point. Now, there are some people who come up with their alternative versions of CPI measures. So there's this one website called shadowstats.com. I don't know much about the authors of this index, but they talk about how they constructed a CPI index which uses the same weightings of goods as you had in 1980. And they've said, okay, if you just fix the basket of goods from 1980, it turns out, and this is the blue line, inflation is much, much higher. So they have inflation at around 10% right now in the US. Whereas official inflation is, closer to 1 to 2%. So it's kind of much, much higher, the measure that they have. Now, there are a couple of problems with the index they use. One is that the consumption basket changes over time. People are consuming different things today as they were in 1980. So in 1980, there were no mobile phones, cable TV or whatever. It's just different. There's also, a more kind of philosophical issue, which is what this shadow stats disagrees with, which is this idea of substitution. And this is in the official CPI data. The compilers of CPI look at a typical basket of goods people buy, and they start to exclude things people stop buying. And so what you could have a situation, this is a classic one, is if somebody consumes beef and chicken, and then the price of beef goes up dramatically, a household might then reduce their consumption of beef and increase their consumption of chicken, so that their overall price of their meat basket stays unchanged. Now, these guys are saying, actually, you shouldn't do that. You should just look at the price of beef and, and say that actually the price of beef has gone up. So then you include that in your CPI index. So the question then is, at what level of aggregation do you look at prices? Do you say we just look at meat overall and look at how households are consuming it, what shares, or do you go down to each component? And so there's this kind of constant struggle between the two. Now, what the CPI official guys, they regularly survey households to see what they're consuming, and then they construct baskets from there, which to me makes a lot of sense. Now, so aside from the methodologies of difference, even if you take this 10% CPI value at face value, what that means is that if you do believe that inflation in the US is running at 10%, that means that almost over the last 8 years, prices have doubled in the US. That's what it means. The prices go up by 10%, you compound it. Every 7 to 8 years, prices will double. Now, if you look at any basic types of goods, you find that prices haven't doubled over the past 10 years. So for example, I looked at the price of a gallon of milk in the US at the retail level. Today, it's around $3.40, and 10 years ago, it was $3.35. So it's pretty much unchanged, the price of milk. You can do the same for televisions and all of these other sorts of things. I mean, prices haven't doubled in the last 10 years. So that makes me suspicious of this alternative measure. Now, another big component of inflation is rent, or the implied rent of a house. So what you normally have in US inflation is something called owner equivalent rent, which is they make an estimate of, if you had to rent the house you're living in, what would it be? And then that forms part of inflation. So I looked at Zillow. So this is a private company in the US that monitors house prices and rents. So it's like Zoopla in the UK. And I looked at how much rent has changed annually in the US. Actually, I've realized the legend here is not expanded enough. But over the last 5 years, they only have data going back 5 years or so. But before COVID, rents in the US were going up around 3 to 4% a year. So not 10%, but 3 to 4%. And then last year, it fell to 0. In New York, which is the blue line, rent was going up by less. And then last year, rents fell by 8%. And then the gray bar here is San Francisco, which is kind of hot area. And you see that rents in San Francisco were actually in line with the national average, but last year collapsed to 7%. So again, this makes me suspicious of this alternative measure of CPI, because probably the most inflationary part of the inflation basket is probably anything to do with property. That's what you'd expect. So if you do believe inflation's at 10%, then the implied rent should be higher than 10% because it's an average. And there's no evidence that rents are going up 10% a year every year. So I don't believe this alternative measure of inflation. So that's not kind of correct. What we can also do is we can look at household surveys of inflation. So there's different surveys in the US, and one is the University of Michigan, where they do a household survey every month, and they ask people, how much do you think prices will change annually over the next 5 years? And this is going back 20, 30 years, and you find that people on average expect inflation to be around 2.5% in the next 5 years. So at the moment, inflation is around 1.7, 1.8%. So households do see somewhat higher inflation than the official data. Obviously, it's a forward-looking one, so we have to see what it realizes. But historically, if I overlaid this with official CPI, households tend to have a 0.5% higher estimation of forecast than the official data. But it's not dramatically different. And one of the reasons households tend to have higher kind of inflation expectations often than the official data is that people often focus on expensive things. You know, the salience, or what people remember. People only remember price increases. People don't remember price decreases. So what you find with these household expectation surveys, they're very sensitive to gasoline prices, petrol prices at the pump. And then in general, prices that are going up. They're less sensitive. They're less aware of prices going down. So tends to be households tend to experience or have a perception that there's higher inflation than there actually is. But even then, it's only 0.5% higher. It's nowhere near, say, 10% higher. And then finally, there's another project done at Harvard, something called the Billion Prices Project, where they look at every single online price of any good, like billions of prices, I guess. And they construct inflation indices for different countries. For the US, they basically find that their online measure of prices is broadly the same as CPI. So it's not too different. It was a bit higher in 2014-15, but it's kind of come back in. This is only up to 2016. I think you have to buy the data, but this is the data I could get from the working paper that they had. So they basically find it's pretty much the same. So using alternative data, so not the government data, but alternative data, retail and online prices, they find the data is pretty much the same. Now, if you look at Argentina, Argentina is famous for making up some of its CPI data. The official data is very different from the actual data in the economy. And there was, in the 2010s, there was a big controversy in Argentina where people really started to argue that there was a difference between real inflation and official inflation. So this Harvard project actually came about to try to estimate what is true Argentine inflation using online prices. And here you find the index is dramatically different. So on this index from 2007, the official index went from 100 to about 250. So a 150% increase, but the real inflation was more like 500% increase in inflation. And they had some currency weakness and things like that as well over that period. So Argentina, if you had to argue that there is fake inflation data out there, a country like Argentina and some of these other more emerging markets are the places where you tend to find that. But the punchline here is whether you look at household surveys, data from rental companies, private rental companies like Zillow, whether you look at online prices, ballpark, they roughly converge to the official CPI data that we have. So my thing is that the official data probably is ballpark accurate. And if anything, my personal sense is I think inflation is probably overstated, because I think that CPI measures don't adequately capture prices in the digital economy that well. So people consume a lot of digital goods, which are free, like Wikipedia or games. If you play Fortnite, it's free, a lot of it. And that's a consumption good, and that's price at zero. And Google and things like that. What's happened is in the digital realm, lots of things that would have cost you money 10, 20, 30 years ago no longer cost you anything. It's free. And yet CPI measures don't really capture that you're actually consuming a free good now. So I actually think that the more we kind of have this sort of digital economy, it becomes harder to kind of adequately measure prices and the consumption of goods. And if anything, that tells me that we're probably overstating inflation, because we're biasing it too much to the physical world, when people actually live in the digital world a lot more and consume a lot in the digital world. If you look at, let me just stop here. If you look at time use surveys in the US, so every couple of years, the US does a survey of how people use time. People tend to spend 3 to 4 hours a day in front of the screen, like on the leisure side, watching TV or playing video games. So that's a lot of leisure time that's being used just in front of a screen. They're not going out to restaurants and things. So if they're doing that, then you have to think, okay, what are they paying for when they consume that? So they could be network television, which is free, but they could be subscribing to Netflix, Amazon Prime, which in general turns out to be cheaper than if you have cable TV. So there's been a price reduction, and you have to make an adjustment for the quantity of entertainment you have available to you compared to what you had before. So the quantities, increase and the price has gone down. Or you're playing video games, and many of the video games are free. And the way they make money is you have to buy skins and all these upgrades in the game. But the basic game is free, and then and so you have to kind of accommodate that. The other thing also, and this comes down to something called hedonic pricing, around when you measure inflation over time, you have to make adjustments for quality. So for example, a television today might be the same price as a television 10 years ago, but today you can buy an Ultra HD TV, 65 inches flat screen for the same price as you could have bought a 45-inch HD TV 10 years ago. So the question is, does that mean the price of the TV is the same, or has the price of a TV gone down? Because what you can buy today is much better, and that's hedonic pricing, where you make an adjustment for the quality. Another aspect of this also is housing. The average size of someone's house in the US has actually gone up by 40% in the last 10, 20 years. So like today, the average house in the US that people live in maybe like 2,000 square foot, whereas 30, 40 years ago, it was like 1,500 square foot. But when you look at the prices, it's all kind of the same. You look at the rent on a house, but actually you're getting more for it. They also have air conditioning, broadband connection. So the quality of housing has also changed. So that's kind of another issue you have to make adjustments for when you're looking at prices. And that's also why sometimes people think, oh, things are more expensive today, but actually what you get for that price is just a lot more than what you got before. And this again goes back to the technology point, that because of technology, you're kind of bundling a lot of things together. So that's kind of another factor when you compile these kind of data sets. So that's kind of the overall thesis. There's especially people in Twitter, a lot of them say, there's fake data, inflation is much higher. But if you look under the hood, and the analysis I've done suggests that actually no, the official data probably is in the right ballpark. And my view, if anything, is we're overstating inflation. So do we have kind of any questions on what I just talked about there?
About Turkey's inflation data, right? And it's certainly true they did fire the head of the stats office when inflation hit 25%, which is never a good look, right? But yeah, I mean, I spent like several months going through all their numbers and saying I couldn't find anything wrong with it. And the one thing in that country as well, people often point to as the whole quality adjustment, right? And they say, well, price of iPhones have gone up by X much, but yeah, inflation hasn't. So there's always arguments about that kind of thing. But I think one thing that's interesting on the inflation debate right now is like how much is actually being captured in the inflation baskets, because consumption patterns have changed so much in the past year, right? And yeah, these baskets get updated in most countries, I think, every year. It's probably a bit variable. But like restaurant prices don't matter to me anymore. Airline prices don't matter. But how long is that true for, right? Will a year from now those prices matter again? So I think it is particularly difficult right now to measure true inflation.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah. And then also if they do make changes to CPI based on last year, 2020 consumption patterns, that isn't,
exactly.
sustainable.
Yeah, it has to be like a lasting pattern, which you just don't know right now.
Yeah. And also last year, there were, at least early on during the COVID pandemic, there were problems actually collecting data, because people were, in lockdown. So the data collection process sort of slowed down. So I think actually, in this period, there might be lots of data issues around quality of data and the consumption baskets. And part of this will be, how much has the world really changed after COVID? So if we bounce back exactly as before, so people are traveling exactly as they were before, then the consumption basket changes will probably change back, in a couple of years, and there'll be this weird kind of anomaly. But then if people change, they might, if they do more domestic travel and foreign travel, there's no business travel anymore, and then something might be persistent, and then actually some of the changes are more valid. So there will be these issues. Any questions from?
My comment is on the hedonic pricing that you had mentioned. I guess to me, it feels like when you try to adjust for quality, you're like you introduce a whole new variable into the inflation calculation that can be tricky. And I suppose that has to do with productivity and how
yeah, no, it's a big problem. It's a big challenge. I think in the end, I think there's only like 3 to 5% of items that get adjusted on a hedonic basis in the end. So it's actually not everything. But it is a big kind of challenge. I mean, if you look at a developed, a rich country, typically the biggest components of inflation are anything to do with like shelter, housing kind of side. Well, actually, food energy is a big component, and there's no hedonic adjustment for that because that's just that. But then there's kind of housing related stuff where I don't think there's hedonic adjustments, but correct me if I'm wrong, Caroline. Then there's education and medical care, and I think there aren't huge adjustments to those. So yeah, that's the biggest chunk of inflation are those things. Then you have clothes and all these other sort of restaurants and things like that. It's only really when you get to technology like TVs, computers, that you get these hedonic adjustments, and that tends overall to be a small component.
Yeah, and there is huge amounts of research done on it, right? I mean, there's teams at the stats offices that only do that. I mean, I read a bit about it. To be honest, it's quite complicated. But there's a few sort of standard methods out there, like sort of internationally accepted ways to do it.
Yeah.
So they do try and be transparent.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, from a market perspective, what matters for me is like there's kind of the platonic reality, platonic truth of there's inflation that we don't know about. We're in the cave looking at the shadows, and we have a methodology to try to capture that. As long as there's some transparency around methodology and consistency over the years, that's what's important from my perspective. So, okay, methodology is roughly the same for the last 10, 20, 30 years. So then we can look at changes in inflation. And then that's what I think the market sort of trades on. So even if you believe inflation was 10%, I showed you that chart of the shadow, the alternative. It's actually said inflation has been stable at 10% since the global financial crisis. So what that is telling you is that even though there's been massive printing of money, inflation's unchanged over that period, which is similar to what official data is saying. So once you make an adjustment for the level, it's the changes that you care about. And so even on their measure, it's basically telling you inflation hasn't changed, even though you've had all this printing of money. So as long as methodology is relatively consistent over a period of time, or if they do change the methodology, they revise the history, then I think that's okay, because what we care about changes. And if you look at the market trades off changes. It doesn't sort of trade off a particular level. It's a change. Has it gone up by 0.1 or 0.2%? So that tells you the market is always trying to look at sort of the marginal information, rather than kind of the absolute kind of level. Cool. Okay then. Great. Okay, we can wrap it up there then. And there's a lot of literature on this subject. You can really go down into sort of different sorts of things. I mean, there's also how you weight the indices. There's different ways you can weight the different components of an index. There's also a big debate around whether you should include housing costs or rents, like Euro area doesn't, US does. There's also the hedonic quality issue. There's also the question of how often should you survey houses. In the US, there's different measures of inflation. There's CPI, PCE, and the Fed favors PCE because they feel that's more representative. In the UK, we have RPI and CPI is more favored over RPI. So there's all these other sorts of differences as well.